The calm before the storm. Arrival at Normandy, June 7th, 1944. June 7th, 1944. Dawn broke over the Norman hedgerows, with a fragile mist curling around the shattered villages and shell-pocked fields. The scent of wet earth and gunpowder hung heavy in the air, and a distant rumble of artillery rolled like thunder across the countryside. From the horizon, the first flickers of movement emerged, armored silhouettes casting long shadows in the morning light. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Callahan peered through the periscope of his M4 Sherman, a freshly issued medium tank, number 223 painted in bold white on its turret. His hands gripped the controls, knuckles white under the vibration of the idling engine. Beside him, his driver, Corporal Henry Martinez, adjusted his goggles and muttered something about the mud. "Hate this part," he said. "Feels like the calm before hell." Across the fields, German Panzer IVs and Tigers began to appear, their dark grey forms cutting through the fog like predators emerging from the forest. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, commanding a platoon of Tigers, squinted at the advancing shapes through binoculars. He sneered, shaking his head. "Shermans," he spat under his breath. "Paper Tigers, no match for steel and firepower." His crews laughed, a brittle, nervous sound that barely masked the tension in their chests. The Sherman tanks rolled forward in disciplined columns, their tracks gnawing at the churned earth, each machine carrying a crew of 5 men: driver, gunner, loader, commander, and co-driver radio operator. The tanks were neither the fastest nor the most heavily armored, but their engines purred with mechanical reliability, and their numbers were staggering. Callahan's unit alone counted 20 Shermans, each poised like a heartbeat, ready to surge forward. Callahan felt the weight of anticipation settle over him. The landscape was a tapestry of danger: craters from earlier bombardments, splintered hedgerows, and the skeletal remains of buildings that had once sheltered family. A bird took flight from a nearby tree, its wings scattering dew into the morning sun. For a brief moment, the world seemed suspended, holding its breath before the storm. Then came the first crack of gunfire, a distant thunk that ricocheted through the morning fog. A Sherman's turret swiveled, its 75mm gun tracking the muzzle flashes in the distance. Martinez whispered, "Here we go," and the column surged forward, the earth shivering beneath the collective weight of steel and determination. On the German side, Richter barked orders: "Flank them, show them what true armor can do." The Tiger's 88mm cannons hummed to life, cutting arcs through the mist, as if painting death across the fields. The first shots rang out. One Sherman hit the edge of its tracks, lurching but refusing to die. Another shell slammed into a Tiger's side, sparking off its armor in a harmless cascade of fire and metal. And in that moment, the battlefield seemed to hold a secret. Individual strength, while impressive, could not withstand a Tiger. For every Sherman that faltered, 2 more advanced engines growling, chains clattering, crews shouting, hearts pounding. The numbers, the relentless forward motion, began to erode the confidence of even the most seasoned panzer crew. The battle for Normandy had begun, and no one yet understood that this was a fight that would not be decided by the supremacy of a single tank, but by the overwhelming, tireless presence of the Sherman in numbers that the Germans had never imagined. Section 2: Clash of Steel. The first engagement, June 7, 1944. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the full scale of the Norman countryside: fields laced with trenches, splintered fences, and the occasional smoldering ruin of a farmhouse. The Sherman column pressed on, engines droning in unison, treads grinding into churned mud, and the air resonating with a metallic symphony of war. Lieutenant Callahan tightened his grip on the controls, scanning the undulating horizon. "Targets at 12 o'clock, he shouted, pointing toward a cluster of Panzer IVs advancing with precision, their crews confident in the superiority of German engineering. The Tigers remained at a distance, a looming threat that could crush a Sherman with a single shot. Yet, Callahan knew their numbers could be leveraged. Corporal Martinez adjusted the Sherman's turret, eyes sharp, fingers steady on the trigger. The first salvo erupted, 75mm shells tearing through the morning silence. One shell struck a Panzer IV squarely, bouncing off thick armor only to catch a fuel drum behind it. Flames erupted. Richter cursed violently through his radio, his face darkening behind the binoculars. Fall back. Focus fire on the lead vehicles. Despite superior German firepower, the Shermans moved as a living organism. When one tank was disabled, another took its place in the line of advance. Crew after crew shouted coordinates, targeting the Germans with a relentless rhythm. The sheer presence of numbers began to blur the Panzer crew's focus. A Tiger's 88mm gun downed one Sherman, but two more closed the gap, circling like predators, compensating for one lost comrade. Callahan felt the vibration through the controls as another Sherman to his left took a direct hit. The loader, Private First Class Thomas Green, yelled over the radio, "We're down, move on." But the column did not halt. The Shermans pressed, machine guns rattling, 75mm rounds snapping, and tearing through enemy armor. Wherever a weak point appeared, Richter's confidence began to crack. These numbers, he muttered, jaw tight. How many of them are there? His men, experienced Panzer crews, were beginning to falter under the relentless, unyielding assault. Unlike the German tanks, which relied on tactical precision and superior firepower, the Americans exploited quantity, a wave that never seemed to break, each Sherman a small cog in an unstoppable machine. On the ground, hedgerows became killing zones. A Sherman rounded a corner, catching a Panzer IV exposed in a narrow lane. Callahan fired a short burst, penetrating the side armor. The German crew scrambled, abandoning the vehicle under a hail of bullets from accompanying Sherman. One by one, German tanks that had once seemed invincible began to falter, not due to superior skill, but because they were simply outnumbered. Amid the chaos, voices shouted over the roar of battle, "Keep moving, don't stop," cried Sergeant Bill Thompson in another Sherman. "If we let them dictate the fight, it's over." Every crewman knew it was not speed or firepower alone that won battles. It was persistence, coordination, and the unrelenting forward motion of Sherman after Sherman. By noon, the German front had begun to crumble. The first line of Panzer IVs retreated, leaving Tigers isolated, forced to engage multiple Shermans at once. Richter's once proud units were now reduced to defensive desperation. Even with their superior guns, they could not match the overwhelming tide of steel and determination crashing toward them. In that moment, the battlefield told a story the Germans had ignored for too long. The Sherman, mocked for its thin armor and modest gun, had become a weapon of attrition, not in one-on-one duels, but in numbers, coordination, and unyielding persistence. The day was far from over, yet the pattern had been set. One tank alone might be outgunned, but dozens, hundreds, they could not be Section 3. Numbers over steel. The Sherman's relentless advance. June 7th, 1944. Midday. Smoke curled in lazy spirals from craters and burning tanks, filling the sky with a grey haze. The Normandy fields were littered with mangled metal, shredded hedgerows, and the stench of fuel and cordite. Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman moved like a tide through the chaos, its treads carving lines into mud-streaked ground. The deafening roar of engines and artillery was punctuated by shouts, alarms, and the occasional anguished cry of a fallen soldier. Corporal Martinez leaned forward, spotting a Tiger lurking behind a damaged barn. Its 88mm cannon tracked them with lethal precision, each movement deliberate and terrifying. Callahan's heart pounded. "Focus fire on that barn. Don't let it flank us," he yelled. The other Shermans fanned out, circling and coordinating, using suppressive fire to pin the Tiger down. The beast fired once, obliterating a nearby Sherman's turret, But the Americans didn't falter. 2 more Shermans advanced, rounding the structure, firing into every weak angle exposed by the Tiger's own design. Richter's nerves frayed. "How are they still coming?" he shouted over the radio, voice raw with panic. The sheer numerical superiority of the Americans had begun to erode the elite discipline of the Panzer crews. No longer could they rely on precision and individual strength. For every tank they destroyed, 2 more took its place, moving in coordinated waves that seemed to anticipate their every move. Across the field, Private Thomas Green adjusted the Sherman's gun, firing round after round at retreating Panzer IVs. "They just keep coming," he yelled, his voice cracked, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The Sherman's strength wasn't in perfection, it was in persistence. Reliability allowed them to keep moving, keep firing, keep overwhelming. Unlike the Panzer, which required careful positioning and maintenance, the Sherman was a workhorse built to endure, and to multiply its effectiveness through sheer quantity. By afternoon, the first major German counterattack faltered. Tigers that had once inspired terror were now isolated, targets for coordinated Sherman volleys. Callahan's crew maneuvered expertly, circling, coordinating, exploiting the limited angles that German armor could defend. One Tiger, forced to rotate under fire, was hit in the rear engine block. Flames erupted, illuminating the smoke-filled battlefield like a ghastly beacon. The human cost was heavy on both sides, yet the psychology of warfare had shifted. Richter's men, once confident in the invincibility of German engineering, now found themselves retreating in disarray, shocked by the relentless numbers pressing against them. Oberleutnant Richter wiped sweat from his brow, heart pounding. "We underestimated them," he muttered under his breath. "Not quality, quantity, it's numbers." Even as German armor regrouped, Sherman crews pressed the advantage. Sergeant Bill Thompson's tank tore through a hedgerow, catching 2 Panzers in crossfire. Explosions punctuated the advancing tide, metal twisting, flames consuming, and German crews abandoning their vehicles in desperation. The realization sank in like ice water. No matter how superior the German tank was in isolation, it could not survive against an unending wave of Sherman. Callahan felt a grim satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that each victory came at a cost. Men and machines alike bore the scars of battle, yet the M4 Sherman had proven itself in ways the Germans could never anticipate. The battlefield was no longer a contest of engineering alone. It was a test of endurance, coordination, and the power of overwhelming numbers. As evening approached, the American advance had pushed German forces back several kilometers, leaving fields littered with wreckage. The once proud panzer columns were broken, diminished not by superior firepower, but by relentless attrition, by the sheer impossibility of stopping a tide that never ceased to advance. Callahan's voice crackled over the radio. "Hold the line. Keep pushing. We're not done yet." Section 4. The German Shock. Realizing the Sherman's true power. June 7, 1944, late afternoon. The Normandy sun slanted through smoke and haze, casting long shadows across shattered fields. The roar of engines had dimmed, replaced by the sporadic crack of distant artillery and the rumble of tanks moving cautiously through wreckage. German commanders, once brimming with confidence, now gathered in ad hoc headquarters in ruined farmhouses, faces pale and drawn with disbelief. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter pounded the map table with his fist, scattering crumbs of bread and cigarette ash. "How many of them are left?" he demanded. His adjutant, a young Lieutenant Weber, could only shake his head. Reports trickled in. Dozens of Sherman still operational, continuously advancing, their crews unyielding despite losses. "Shermans," Richter muttered through clenched teeth, the word tasting bitter. "They are everywhere. Even when one falls, another takes its place. And they don't stop. They never stop." On the battlefield, Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman crew paused briefly behind a shattered hedgerow, surveying the terrain. Smoke rose from overturned panzers, and the occasional Tiger loomed like a ghost in the distance,
half hidden among ruined walls. Callahan exhaled slowly, realizing the extent of what they had accomplished. The German front line, once confident, was now fractured and desperate. The Germans' early confidence in superior engineering and heavier firepower had blinded the Panzer IVs and Tigers could easily destroy a Sherman in one exchange, but they could not destroy 20, 40 or 100 advancing in waves. The arithmetic of war had shifted. Each Sherman that fell was replaced, each gap in the line filled, creating a momentum that German armor simply could not match. Even seasoned panzer crews, veterans of Kursk, Tunisia and earlier Western Front engagements, struggled to comprehend the scale. Captain Heinrich Müller, watching through binoculars, as yet another Sherman emerged from a smoke-filled field, muttered, "They are relentless, not a machine or swarm." The psychological weight was crushing. Fear was no longer a result of skill or cunning alone, but of impossibility, the overwhelming inevitability of numbers. Callahan's radio crackled with coordination orders. Each crew adjusted their formations, using hedgerows, sunken roads, and ruined barns for cover. Sherman after Sherman surged forward, firing, maneuvering, suppressing the remaining German tanks. Or Tiger tried to dominate an open field with its mighty 88mm gun, but 5 Shermans flanked and targeted its weaker rear armor. With a final explosion, it erupted in flames. The German High Command's pride in precision engineering had faltered under a relentless tide of reliable, moderately armed, yet infinitely replaceable tanks. For the first time, Oberleutnant Richter realized the technical superiority could not compensate for attrition. It was not perfection, speed or armor alone that decided battles. It was persistence, coordination, and numbers. Backing Callahan's Sherman, the crew felt the weight of the day. Exhaustion pressed against their bodies, but a grim satisfaction coursed through. The M4 Sherman, mocked for years by German officers and tank enthusiasts alike, had proven itself beyond doubt, a testament to industrial might, strategic foresight, and the relentless American doctrine of war. Even as night fell, the battlefield remained alive with movement. Shermans patrolled, searched and secured territory, while the Germans scrambled to regroup. That day, the myth of invincible panzer superiority had been shattered. The Sherman had not won through elegance or singular might. It had conquered through endurance, numbers and unyielding human will.
Section 5. The Tide Turns. Exploiting Momentum, June 8, 1944. The first light of dawn revealed a battlefield, transformed. Fields once dotted with proud German armor now lay scarred and blackened, twisted metal and smoke marking the relentless path of the Sherman advance. Lieutenant Callahan's tank rumbled forward, treads chewing through mud, engine humming steadily despite the wear of constant movement. Around him, Sherman after Sherman pressed on, forming a rolling wave of armored persistence. Corporal Martinez kept a sharp eye on the horizon. "I don't think they even know where to shoot anymore," he muttered, adjusting the Sherman's turret. The previous day's chaos had left German units scattered, disorganized and hesitant. Tiger and Panzer IV crews that survived the initial engagement were now cautious, waiting for reinforcements that would not arrive in time. Oberleutnant Richter, still reeling from the previous day's losses, attempted to consolidate his remaining forces. Reports trickled in. Panzer columns fractured, supply lines disrupted, and morale at a breaking point. They can't all be stopped," he whispered to his adjutant. "No single tank, no single strategy can hold them." On the ground, the Americans exploited every weakness. Shermans moved in coordinated groups, covering each other's flanks, and advancing through craters, shell holes, and torn-up hedgerows. Sergeant Bill Thompson's tank fired a quick salvo into the side of a hidden Tiger, forcing it to retreat. Another Sherman moved in from behind, cutting off escape routes and isolating enemy armor. The combination of persistent movement and numerical superiority left the Germans struggling to adapt. The psychological impact was just as decisive as the physical destruction.
Panzer crews, once confident in their vehicle's invincibility, now hesitated at every hedgerow and tree line. Even the mighty Tiger, capable of knocking out a Sherman with a single shot, could not survive being surrounded, outflanked, and relentlessly harassed by waves of tanks. The Germans had underestimated the power of quantity, and it was proving fatal. Callahan felt a grim awareness settle over him. Every Sherman lost was a reminder of the human cost, yet each one advancing in its place reinforced an unstoppable truth: numbers could overwhelm precision. The American industrial machine ensured the tanks would keep coming, crews trained and ready, engines running, until the battlefield itself belonged to them. By midday, the Germans had been pushed further back, their once proud formations broken and demoralized. Oberleutnant Richter surveyed the field through binoculars, face pale under his helmet. "They are everywhere," he muttered, voice trembling. "How can so few be so many?" The Sherman's relentless advance forced German commanders to reconsider their strategies. They had trained for tactical superiority, relying on the unmatched firepower of their panzers. Yet here lay the undeniable reality: even the best tank, facing waves of coordinated, reliable and numerous opponents, was vulnerable. The battlefield itself had changed, and the lesson was cruelly simple. In the war of attrition, numbers mattered more than perfection. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows over Normandy, Callahan's crew continued their push, eyes scanning, guns ready, hearts pounding. Each Sherman that survived, each kilometer gained, reinforced a truth the Germans would learn too late. The war would not be decided by a single perfect tank, but by the overwhelming persistence of those willing to keep coming. Again in Section 6, breaking the German line. The Sherman's domination, June 9, 1944. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the Normandy fields, swirling around shattered hedgerows and the twisted carcasses of Panzer IVs and Tigers. The Americans advanced steadily, a rolling wave of green and olive steel, engines growling over churned earth, treads sending mud flying like shrapnel. Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman led a small column through a shell-blasted village, windows blown out, roofs caved in, the remnants of civilian life littering the streets. Corporal Martinez adjusted the turret, scanning for move. "I count 3 panzers ahead, maybe a Tiger behind that wall," he said quietly. Callahan nodded. "Keep moving. We don't give them a chance to breathe." The Sherman's engine hummed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, the crew attuned to every vibration, every sound, every shadow. The German forces were on edge. Oberleutnant Richter had convened an emergency council in a ruined farmhouse. "They never stop," he admitted grimly, voice echoing off scorched beams. "Every Sherman we knock out, 2 more take its place. Our calculations, they are meaningless against numbers." His adjutants exchanged worried glances. Morale was fraying. The pride that had once defined the Wehrmacht's armored divisions was cracking under the sheer pressure of persistent American machine. On the battlefield, the Shermans exploited every advantage. Using hedgerows as cover, they emerged suddenly, unleashing coordinated volleys at exposed panzer. One Sherman fired a 75mm shell that pierced the side armor of a Panther, lurking behind a barn, flames erupting as the vehicle's fuel ignited. Another Sherman moved to flank a Tiger, targeting its weaker rear armor with rapid shot. The Germans could fire once, maybe twice, but the Americans' relentless approach left them exposed and vulnerable. Even experienced German tank crews were shaken. Captain Heinrich Müller, commanding a small Tiger detachment, barked orders, but his men hesitated, scanning every hedgerow, expecting attacks that came from multiple directions simultaneously. The math of battle had shifted. The Tiger's superior guns were formidable, yet the Americans' unending numbers made every shot a gamble, and every miss allowed another Sherman to advance, another salvo to find its mark. Callahan's tank moved through the village square, dust and smoke thick in the air. The sound of explosions and gunfire was deafening, yet in the chaos, A sense of inevitability settled over him. Each Sherman that moved, each enemy tank disabled, was a confirmation of what they had learned through sweat, gunfire, and endurance. Perfection alone could not dominate the battlefield. Persistence, coordination, and numbers could. By mid-afternoon, the German line had broke. Panzer units scattered, retreating in disorder, leaving fields and villages littered with the remnants of what had once been formidable armor. Oberleutnant Richter's pride had been shattered, replaced by disbelief. "We were outnumbered," he whispered, staring at reports streaming. It wasn't firepower. It wasn't skill. It was them. Always coming. Callahan's Sherman rumbled past. Overturned tanks and smoldering ruins. The crew exhausted, but exhilarated. The numbers had won. Tanks that were mocked for thin armor and modest guns had crushed the German myth of invincibility through sheer persistence, coordinated action, and overwhelming quantity. The lesson was indelible. The war was decided not by the perfection of a single tank, but by the relentless tide of Shermans, coming again and again.
Section 7. The Cost of Victory. Sacrifice and Realization, June 10th, 1944. Twilight settled over the Normandy countryside, casting long shadows across smoldering ruins and mud-churned fields. The once proud German armored formations had been broken, but victory had come at a heavy cost. Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman bore scratches, dents, and scorched metal, testament to the furious battles it had survived. Inside, the crew was battered, faces streaked with grime and sweat, but eyes bright with grim satisfaction. Corporal Martinez adjusted his goggles, scanning the horizon for any lingering threats. "I can't believe we made it through that," he muttered. Callahan nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing against him. Every tank lost, every crewman injured, was a reminder that numbers alone did not guarantee safety. Persistence came with sacrifice. Across the battlefield, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter walked among the wreckage of his once mighty Panzer column. Tigers and Panzer IVs lay twisted and blackened in the fields, symbols of German engineering brought low by unrelenting quantity. He stopped beside a destroyed Tiger, hands trembling as he traced the scorched metal. We underestimated them," he admitted, voice low almost to himself. "Not because they were superior, but because there were too many of them." German crews, some still in their tanks, stared in disbelief at the advancing Shermans that seemed to appear from nowhere, each one ready to replace the last. The realization hit like a hammer. Tactical brilliance and superior firepower were futile against an endless tide. The Americans' industrial capacity, training, and coordination had created a weapon that was simple, reliable, and overwhelmingly numerous. The numbers themselves were a weapon. Callahan's crew moved cautiously through a village, checking for survivors, scouting for enemy remnants. Private First Class Thomas Green paused beside a destroyed Panzer, muttering, "They thought they were invincible, and look at them now." Callahan felt a chill. The destruction was immense, yet it was the only way forward. The Sherman had proven that survival, endurance, and persistence could outweigh superior technology, a lesson written in steel and fire across the fields of Normandy. Even as night fell, the Americans maintained their vigilance. The shattered German lines retreated further, forced to regroup, rethink, and respect a doctrine they had ignored. Numbers, not perfection, could decide the outcome of a battle. In the dim glow of fires from burning tanks, Richter's men began to understand the truth. One Tiger, however powerful, could not stop an unending wave of Shermans. Callahan looked across the battlefield, watching smoke curl from wrecked tanks, hearing the distant shouts of other Sherman crews pushing forward. "It's not just a tank," he said quietly. "It's the way we use them, the way we keep going. That's what wins war." The night air was heavy with reflection, the ground littered with sacrifice. Yet the Americans had gained momentum, not through perfection, but through numbers, endurance,
and an unwavering drive to keep moving. The German commander's mockery had turned to horror, and the Sherman, once dismissed as mediocre, had become the symbol of relentless, unstoppable power. Section 8. The Industrial Weapon. How Numbers Became Power. June 11. The sun rose over Normandy, painting the fields in shades of gold and grey. The battlefield had quieted, though occasional gunfire and distant artillery still echoed like reminders of the previous day's fury. Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman crew moved cautiously, scanning for the last pockets of resistance. What had been chaos was now a testament to the power of sheer production and coordination. Corporal Martinez, wiping soot from the tank's viewport, muttered, "I keep thinking about how many of these things are coming behind us. Hundreds more." Callahan nodded grimly. He knew the Sherman was not a miracle machine. It was a reliable workhorse. Its strength lay not in perfection, speed or armor, but in numbers. The industrial might of America meant that every Sherman lost was replaced, each new tank manned by trained crews ready to continue the assault. Across the shattered fields, the Germans faced a hard truth. Oberleutnant Richter and his surviving officers huddled around maps and reports, their faces lined with disbelief. "We can't match this," Richter admitted. "Even if every tank we have left fires perfectly, they will just keep coming. There's no stopping it." The Wehrmacht had relied on technical superiority, the idea that quality alone would win battles, but the Normandy campaign had rewritten the rules. The Sherman's numbers created a psychological and tactical advantage that could not be measured by armor thickness or gun caliber alone. For every Panzer destroyed, multiple Shermans would advance, each coordinating with the next, turning attrition into a weapon. Callahan felt this firsthand as his column moved forward. Obstacles were overcome, enemy positions suppressed, and victories compounded not by individual heroism, but by relentless, collective force. In a destroyed village, a group of American tank crews paused to check on civilians. The war had left devastation in its wake, but it also demonstrated a lesson in the industrial age of warfare. Quantity, when harnessed with strategy and coordination, could overwhelm even the best trained, best equipped opponent. The Sherman had become more than a tank. It was an extension of American industrial might, a rolling manifestation of numbers triumphing over perfection. Even German survivors recognized. Captain Heinrich Müller, surveying the ruins of his Panzer detachment, muttered bitterly, "It's not our tanks, it's the sheer volume. We can't stop them." The Normandy fields were littered with evidence: burnt-out Panzers, abandoned Tigers, and relentless Shermans pressing forward, reminding the enemy that attrition and numbers were now decisive. By evening, the Americans held the high ground, having pushed German forces back several kilometers. Callahan's Sherman rolled slowly across a ridge, crew tense but alert, engines humming with quiet confidence. The message was clear: no single tank could dominate a battle if faced with unending waves of reliable, coordinated opponents. The Sherman had proven its worth not through perfection, but through persistence, coordination, and the relentless power of numbers.
Section 9. Lessons Learned. German Shock and Adaptation. June 12, 1944. Morning mist hung low over Normandy, clinging to hedgerows and the shell-ravaged fields like a reluctant witness to the carnage below. The shattered remnants of German armor still littered the roads, reminders of a doctrine that had failed to account for the overwhelming tide of Shermans. Lieutenant Callahan's tank moved steadily gaudily, engine humming, treads cutting through mud and debris, while his crew scanned the horizon for signs of remaining resistance. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter paced behind the safety of a ruined farmhouse, eyes fixed on maps and reports of lost territory. The scale of defeat weighed heavily on him. His once confident Panzer divisions had been shattered, not by superior skill or firepower, but by numbers, by relentless waves of Shermans that had pushed forward with mechanical precision and human endurance. "We underestimated them," he admitted, voice tight with frustration. "Their tanks may not be perfect, But there are too many of them, and they keep coming. Across the fields, the Americans pressed their advantage. Each Sherman moved in coordinated formations, supporting one another, exploiting weak points, and cutting off German lines of retreat. Callahan's crew had witnessed dozens of enemy tanks fall to coordinated fire, and even the legendary Tigers were forced to retreat, isolated and unable to respond to the overwhelming numbers. The lesson was clear, even to the German commanders. Battlefield superiority was no longer determined by individual engineering brilliance alone. Reliability, production capacity, and persistence could outmatch even the finest armor and heaviest guns. Oberleutnant Richter's officers took notes, their grim faces acknowledging a painful truth. The Sherman's victory lay not in ingenuity, but in industrial might and relentless execution. On the ground, Callahan maneuvered his Sherman around the remains of a panzer column. Smoke from burning tanks rose in thick plumes, staining the sky. "It's over. For them, at least for now," muttered Corporal Martinez, awe mingled with exhaustion. The crew realized that each day of relentless Shermans rolling forward forced the Germans to adapt, rethink, and respect a doctrine they had ignored for years, that numbers, when harnessed with discipline and coordination, could be more decisive than perfection. Even as the Americans held the field, the war was far from over. German engineers and commanders began revising tactics, acknowledging the need to counter the seemingly endless tide of Sherman tanks. Yet the psychological impact of this new reality was profound. For the first time, the myth of Panzer invincibility had been shattered. The lesson would echo across battlefields for the remainder of the war. Quantity, persistence, and coordination could crush the best tanks the Germans had to offer. Callahan's Sherman continued forward, each rotation of the treads a quiet affirmation of industrial might, endurance, and the relentless human will. The German forces may adapt, may regroup, but the lesson was now indelibly written on the fields of Normandy. In the war of attrition, numbers could triumph over perfection, and the Sherman had proven it in the harshest classroom imaginable. Section 10. Triumph through persistence. The Sherman's legacy. June 13, 1944. The sun rose over Normandy, illuminating the scarred fields in a cold, sharp light. Smoke from burning tanks still lingered, mingling with the morning mist, but the American advance had held firm. Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman rolled forward, crew alert, yet weary, eyes scanning for any sign of lingering resistance. The battle was not yet over, but the course had been decisively. Corporal Martinez adjusted his turret, muttering, "I still can't believe how many of these things we've got out here." Callahan allowed himself a small nod. The Sherman was no miracle weapon. Its individual design was modest, vulnerable yet its strength lay in the relentless tide of numbers, the endurance of its crews, and the industrial machine that produced them in staggering quantities. For every Sherman knocked out, another took its place, unflinching and ready to fight. Across the battlefield, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter and his officers regrouped. Their pride in German engineering had been shattered, replaced by the sobering realization that they could not match the sheer scale and persistence of American armored division. Even the most formidable Tigers, with their legendary 88mm guns, had been isolated and destroyed, victims of an unending wave that never faltered. "We were unprepared for this, for numbers over perfection," Richter admitted quietly, the words tasting bitter. The Sherman had demonstrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare: reliability, coordination, and overwhelming numbers could triumph over technical superiority. Each victory, each kilometer gained, reinforced the lesson. American crews learned to press the advantage relentlessly, moving from village to village, field to field, ensuring that German forces could never recover their confidence or cohesion. On the ground, Callahan's crew maneuvered past the ruins of another panzer column. Smoke and fire painted the horizon in shades of gray and orange, but there was a rhythm to the chaos,
a relentless forward motion that spoke of strategy, endurance, and collective will. The Sherman, once mocked as inferior, had become a symbol of industrial might and battlefield persistence. By late afternoon, the German retreat had become a rout. The combination of attrition, coordinated assaults, and sheer numbers had forced the enemy to abandon strong points, leaving Sherman after Sherman to roll across the Norman countryside unopposed. Callahan allowed himself a breath, watching his comrades advance, engines humming in unison, tracks biting into mud. The lesson of Normandy was clear. Numbers, persistence, and coordination could crush even the most technically superior enemy. The legacy of the Sherman would endure beyond these fields. It was not the best tank in a one-on-one duel. It was not invincible, yet, through numbers and relentless pressure, it had proven decisive, shaping the course of battles and rewriting the rules of armored warfare. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the scarred land, Lieutenant Callahan's Sherman rolled on, a testament to persistence, industrial power, and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to stop.